Dear students, thank you for joining me. Today we will talk about news translation. In our today's agenda, we have 5 important aspects related to news translation, and we will try to cover them all. First of all, we will talk about functions of news and the role of news translation. We will discuss translation strategies and constraints of news translation. And finally, I will provide some recommendations to news translators. Functions of news. News has multiple functions, but the most important functions are these ones that you see on the slides. First of all, it informs public about current events happening inside and outside a certain country. It also reflects public opinion. And what I mean by this is that news often acts as a certain mirror that shows what is important for public at the current moment. For example, if you open news portals in Kazakhstan, you will see that the top news in the past year has been the news about COVID-19 and vaccine development. And it is the top news, it has the main coverage because it is important for people to follow all this news, and it is important. They are concerned about this whole pandemic situation. So it reflects public opinion. One of the most important functions of news is that it shapes public opinion, shapes public view about certain events, places, people, political situations, and so on, innovations. And a lot of people use this function for their own benefit, and they use the possibility of the news coverage to influence public opinion and sometimes even change it. The role of news translation. The news production usually have these three the news production usually has these 3 steps: gathering, dissemination, and interpretation. Gathering usually happens nowadays in the office where the journalist translator works, and a journalist just enters a news portal of a source country, gathers and structures the news, prepares it for the dissemination, which means they translate it, adapt it, and interpret it, and then they give it to the people who are responsible for broadcasting and otherwise disseminating this news. So the role of translation is important in all these steps. The accurate and objective translation is something that is considered as an ideal. But whether it is possible to achieve this ideal, it's another thing. There are 2 main translation strategies. The first one is domesticating, and the next one is foreignizing. What means domesticating? Domesticating when a translator tries to produce translations that comply with linguistic and cultural norms of the target audience. In other words, when people read or listen to this news, they feel that it sounds natural, as if it's something that was produced specifically for them. And sometimes it is very difficult to differentiate whether, for example, if the names of places and people are eliminated from the text, is taken out, it would be very difficult to pinpoint whether this news was produced in a foreign country, for whether it has a foreign context, or whether it was produced in the target country. Foreignizing. It means preserving the foreignness of the original text. It means preserving some cultural differences in translation of idioms or collocations, for example, some grammatical structures in order to show that this text is foreign, that it has this uniqueness and originality, that it is different from the domestic news. There are some debates going on which of these strategies is better, but I think they both are important and they are both useful, but translators and news writers should consider the context first and then choose one or another. Constraints of news translation. So first of all, it's time pressure. Nowadays, the internet allows us to access any news almost instantly. So there is an immense pressure on reporters, news writers, and translators to produce, translate, and disseminate news very quickly. All the news agencies, they are trying to be the first, the best, and broadcast and disseminate the most latest news and the sensational news, and to be first in this process. And this time pressure might lead to a lot of translation difficulties and misunderstandings. During our Zoom session, I will talk about it a little bit more, and I will provide you actual examples from the internet when, for example, BBC during the news broadcasting made certain mistakes because of this time pressure. They didn't have to translate it correctly. I will give you example, you will see. Human resources might be also a difficulty. If you notice during this presentation, I'm using several terms interchangeably. I'm using the term journalist, reporter, news writer, translator, interpreter, and in all of these cases, I'm talking about news translation. Why? Because in a lot of cases, journalists, they do not have competences and they didn't get education in news translation. They are not translators, they are not interpreters, they are journalists. And it's very important, of course, for them because they need to know how to gather the news, how to prepare it for the dissemination, how to interpret it, and so on. It's very important. But because they do not have the skills in translation, this education in translation, they might leave certain difficulties and certain misunderstandings, which can cause a lot of problems, especially, for example, if we talk about the international news coverage. There are a lot of examples on the internet. You can find them yourself very easily when the news agencies, because of these human resource problems, made this kind of difficulties. They didn't have the translator from the source country to the target country, and they used machine translation, for example, and because of that, the translation was incorrect and it was misleading and even caused some scandals on the international level. Government-owned news agencies. What I mean by that is that a lot of news agencies nowadays, they receive financial support from the government. If they receive that kind of financial support, it means that the government might dictate them how the news should be interpreted and how it should be disseminated. And this kind of position of a government, in a lot of cases, this kind of government-owned news agencies, they have to consider, take into consideration the official position of the government towards a certain news or towards a certain event, and follow the guidelines or follow that kind of abide by this position. And of course, it can lead to a lot of subjectivity and bias. There are also news agencies that they are profit-making news agencies. So in many cases, they are independent from the government, but it does not mean that they are more objective. they might be they might gravitate towards the news, um, the news that is they think would attract attention of their own target audience. So, for example, they might consider that some news, they will give more coverage to some news, but they might ignore some important news because they would not consider it as important and interesting for their target audience. And because they are making profit from this news business, they would, of course, prioritize that news which is important for their audience. Translation in the field. I said that there is nowadays translation that people do gather information without even leaving their offices. They can use the internet and so on. But sometimes translation in the field does happen. For example, a few years ago, a group of reporters, I think they were they were doing documentary about the ecological situation in the Aral Sea and how the Kazakhstani government is, contributing to the reviving of the Aral Sea. And when they came, they looked for the translators, local translators, who would translate from Kazakh language to English. And in this case, these kind of situations might lead to some difficulties as well. Of course, they will try to hire the local people with very good command of English, but it does not guarantee that the translation would be accurate and correct. So they have to depend on that, and this kind of translation in the field might cause some misunderstanding as well. And then linguistic difficulties, of course, if they are doing the translations themselves, and even if they are bilingual and they know the source language very well, there still be some difficulties in translation. These linguistic difficulties, we discuss them all the time, and you know how to address them. So these are the main difficulties of news translation. So what are the recommendations? Well, again, there are ethical issues, ethical guidelines that journalists follow, that translators follow. It is accuracy and objectivity, trying to produce accurate news and be objective. The topic of whether it is possible to achieve objectivity or not is one thing, because in many cases, researchers who study news translation say that to achieve total objectivity is not possible, that there is always a certain level of interpretation. But anyway, journalists, they try to achieve this accuracy and objectivity, in most cases. But there is, on the other side, there is an overarching political, economical, and technological issues that they have to take into account. So, and in many cases, journalists and translators find themselves between these two positions, between accuracy and objectivity, and between complying with political and economical and technological possibilities. So what should translators do? So first of all, they need to try to be very informed about their about the source country, about what is happening in the source country, about how the news that they are translating, how that news they are translating have been gathered and produced. That they should at least question the trustworthiness of the source that they are taking news from. Knowing the context and knowing the priorities is also very important. If translators work in the news agency that receives financial support from the government, of course they will already know how and when they can talk about certain issues, and when they should, and how they should maybe avoid politically challenging moments and issues. But in other cases, it's important to learn about the context and see what kind of priorities are going on, and the general cycle should be neutral. If in translating news, a translator does not know how to approach it, he or she should consult with the colleagues or try to be as neutral as possible. Well, of course, if we talk about the news agencies who receive money, they consider news broadcasting as business. In this case, this kind of being neutral and trying to be neutral and politically correct might not work for them. But in general, it is very important to remember that knowing the context and knowing the priorities is very important. Another thing is staying respectful towards the target audience and staying respectful towards the source audience, to the source country. It's very important not to joke about certain things that might be offensive in the source culture, and these are like a very fine line between this kind of producing a very sensational news and at the same time staying respectful towards target and source audience. But every interpreter, every reporter and translator tries to find this way how to address these issues. And of course, as usual, I recommend you not to just limit yourself with this short lecture, but actually go ahead and read this chapter by Holland. It's called News Translation. And my presentation was fully based on this chapter. And I highly recommend you to read about this. And during our Zoom session, we will consider more resources, but they would be resources that I would use as examples for the issues that we will discuss. But this is like the theoretical base. Why I'm recommending this book. First of all, it is very clearly written. It's engaging. It's interesting. Especially the beginning is very engaging and attracts readers' attention. And I hope you would enjoy it. But also because we have access to this book chapter on our university's website. So go ahead, download it, read it, and then next time during this Zoom session, we will discuss it. And I will share some of my experience. It is very limited, but still I have some personal experience that I will share, and we will discuss this new translation in more details during our Zoom sessions. So thank you for your attention, and goodbye.